On BBC Two shortly, the season of films starring Paul Newman continues with the first showing on British television of Robert Altman's unusual western Buffalo Bill and the Indians, co-starring Burt Lancaster. That's on BBC Two. Here on One, in 25 minutes, Nick Ross and Sue Cook present the first in a new series, Crime Watch UK, which invites you, the viewer, to become detective and help the police investigate cases which remain unsolved. Crime Watch UK at 9:25. Now, the 9 o'clock news with John Humphreys.
Miners fight police outside Parliament, 120 arrested. Parents of the missing baby are under arrest. Sikhs riot in India, they warn Mrs. Gandhi, you've insulted us. All smiles at the summit, but Reagan's under fire on interest rates. And why Spanish fruit is worrying Europe. Good evening. The striking miners took their protest to London today, and by the time it was over, 120 people had been arrested, including an MP, Dave Nellist. The miners had marched through the city and then went to demonstrate outside Parliament, and that's when they clashed with police. Several miners and policemen were hurt. Earlier, Mr. Scargill had said he was prepared for the strike to last until next winter, and tonight he's won support from other unions for a boycott of oil and fuel to power stations. In the Commons, MPs debated the strike for the first time, and there were angry exchanges there too. Conservatives attacked Mr. Scargill, he was called vain and intransigent, and Labour said the government was constantly misleading the House.
Miners' leaders were joined at the head of the march by representatives of the Labour Party who'd fight their cause inside Parliament later. They included Party General Secretary Jim Mortimer and Eric Heffer, the chairman. It was essentially a miners' march with banners from striking and some mostly non-striking areas too, amongst the 10,000 plus marchers. But there were banners too from other unions and groups, including the women's support groups for miners. But there was one woman who seemed in the wrong march. The route took in Fleet Street, home of the newspapers so bitterly attacked by their leaders, and the opportunity was not missed. Then a rally with speeches from familiar faces. That was followed by a call from Arthur Scargill for everyone to picket at Orgreave. And this declaration, which scarcely reflected the fact that Mr. Scargill is to meet the coal board tomorrow for negotiations.
Together, if we remain united, not only will we never be defeated, but in the process we'll roll back the years of Thatcherism and turn economic disaster into economic prosperity and pave the way for a system that pays more attention to life rather than creating weapons of death and destruction. We're going to win! Keep on! We can't lose!
It was after this meeting that trouble broke out, first in Jubilee Gardens, then over the bridge in Westminster, as miners queued to lobby MPs. There were scuffles and arrests. And one unexpected development, Charing Cross and Waterloo East stations were closed tonight as drivers walked out to support miners. Meanwhile, Mr. Scargill was at the Transport Union appealing for more help and being promised stronger action over ports and power station oil supplies. Later, he met railway and Siemens unions in a further attempt to stop coal and oil movements.
Inside the Commons, it was reasonably rackety, with not one word of explanation about yesterday's leaked Downing Street documents and the Prime Minister's alleged behind-the-scenes intervention in the strike. Mr. Peter Shaw for Labour accused her of treating the nationalised industry chairman like puppets, but the government's tactic was obviously to come out fighting. And to the utter astonishment of the House, Mr. John Biffin, the leader, normally the mildest of men, was instantly transformed into Basher Biffin. No puppets, he said.
I certainly do not think that the correspondence bears that construction at all. What it does do, it shows that this government, having its responsibilities to the public interest and the taxpayer, and in industries where there are an enormous public financing content, take a very proper and prudent regard to the level of pay settlements.
And he called Mr. Scargill vain and intransigent. Mr. Scargill missed that bit, and the Labour suggestions of policemen who were collecting a kitty for their colleagues who had arrested him. But the noise from Labour rose when he popped in to hear a bit of this argument. It was even higher when Mr. Michael Foot, back now in his old rip-roaring backbench form, accused Mrs. Thatcher of, went for Mrs. Thatcher hammer and tongs.
They have no comprehension of how strong is the feeling about the way in which they've been forced into this dispute.
Order!
No comprehension of how increased that bitterness will be when they read how the Prime Minister has lied to this House of the Country. These are the questions.
And Mr. Tony Benn accused the police of a cavalry charge against unarmed pickets. A disgrace, he said. Mr. Stan Orme, the official Labour spokesman, said the government was deliberately picking a fight with the miners. No, said the Energy Secretary, Mr. Peter Walker, their offer to the miners was fabulous. Yes, they had intervened in mining to give miners the best ever pay and conditions.
Some Conservative MPs think more leaks of sensitive information could be on the way. They fear that a growing number of civil servants have lost all sympathy with government policies. Our political correspondent David Davis reports.
After the Sarah Tisdall case and this week's revelations, many Conservative MPs, including some with ministerial responsibility, believe that 1984 is turning into a vintage year for government leaks. Only last March, police were called in to investigate how budget plans had been revealed in advance. And later that month came another embarrassment for the government, with the Defence Ministry civil servant confessing to the sale of sensitive documents. The Conservative Anthony Beaumont-Dark believes such incidents aren't a coincidence, and he forecasts more leaks to come.
Well, I think the main motive behind the leak is a kind of sense of disillusion, because the government's had to do very stern measures. I mean, in the country, people have had unemployment. The civil services had to be cut, quite rightly. They used to live under the Clegg Commission, where there were automatic big increases. I think there's a feeling now that the civil service isn't what it was, and they're not important and not loved or wanted. And I think some of that loyalty has broken down. They haven't come to terms with reality as people have had to outside.
This week's publication of another sensitive government document has clearly brought Conservative concern out into the open. But if the leaks do continue, as many Tory MPs fear and forecast, something they insist will have to be done. It's a dangerous trend, they believe, and damage they accept has already been done to the government.
There was trouble in the Scottish coal field when miners tried to stop coal being taken from an open cast site in Fife. 60 people were arrested during the day as the miners clashed with police. The pickets were trying to stop lorries leaving the mine, and at one point they succeeded in forcing the police back. But the road was then cleared and the lorries eventually went through. And in Kent, miners' leader Malcolm Pitt has been found guilty of obstructing a police officer on a picket line. He'd been in custody for 19 days after breaching his conditions of bail, and he was fined £100. Nurses are to get a 7.5% pay increase after all. That's the full amount recommended by their pay review body, and it had been thought they'd get less. Doctors and dentists will get an average increase of only 4.6%, well below the recommended rise. It'll be paid partly now, partly in November. And the government is giving the armed forces 4.9%, again in 2 stages.
So the nurses are being treated as a special case, as the government promised. For Sister Mary Hoare, it's worth £500 on her £7,000 a year salary. She doesn't think that's over-generous, but is worried how the hospitals will find the extra money.
I just hope it doesn't mean that the resources go as we lose staff from other departments in that case, because it's no use robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Is that what you fear will happen?
I think that's what will happen, that we will lose staff from other departments, so that the resources and the services within the National Health Service will disintegrate.
The bulk of the finance will come from the government's contingency reserve, but health authorities will have to make some economies. The government says they can afford it.
Already the reports from the health authorities indicate that savings inside health authority spending can be made. Not savings from jobs so much as from simple things like energy savings, transport savings, all the things that any service, any business can make as savings.
The nurses' rise is way above what the government had allowed, and the public sector pay bill is turning out very expensive. The government says the nurses are special, but that won't cut much ice with the teachers, civil servants and local authority staff, all of whom have still to settle.
Police have arrested the parents of Louise Brown, the Down syndrome baby who disappeared from the family car in West London a week and a half ago. They were detained after failing to turn up at a meeting police had arranged for this morning. It's understood they're being questioned separately tonight at 2 London police stations.
The missing baby's parents are Paul Brown and Susan Pullen, seen here with their other daughter. 10 days ago, they reported that Louise had disappeared in this car, which they'd left parked outside a post office in Battersea. Louise's father, who took part in this reconstruction, said they were in the post office for a matter of minutes. When they came out, he said the car and the baby had gone. Police asked for public help in a new line of inquiry. A couple was said to have been travelling on a bus in the vicinity of the post office shortly before the baby's disappearance was reported. Police said witnesses had responded to their appeal. Paul Brown and Susan Pullen were arrested today after failing to turn up for a pre-arranged interview with the police. They were detained so that they could be questioned in the presence of their solicitor.
There have been violent protests across northern India today. Mrs. Gandhi was warned by Sikh rioters, "You've insulted us and you must pay for it." Government forces had stormed the Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar last night and killed their leader, Sant Bhindranwale, and nearly 250 other Sikh extremists. Today, the Sikhs retaliated with killings in the Punjab, where they want to set up their own state, and in Kashmir to the north. And in the Indian capital, police opened fire on hundreds of demonstrators who rioted at the city's biggest Sikh shrine. Brian Hanrahan is there.
In New Delhi, violence erupted around one of the Sikhs' principal temples, with both abuse and stones being hurled from its upper stories. Occasionally, the Sikhs made forays into the surrounding streets, battling several hundred police who tried to contain them with tear gas. But the wind dispersed it quickly, and sometimes the Sikhs threw the canisters back, forcing the police to retreat. The two sides surged back and forth around the temple gates. There were casualties on both sides. Policemen were hit by the barrage of missiles. And when the police ran out of tear gas, they began firing shots into the temple grounds. 2 Sikhs were killed. Elsewhere in northern India, other, more vicious battles were going on. In all, more than a dozen people were reported killed today, adding to the hundreds who've died in the past couple of days.
A backlash like this was expected. The Indian Home Ministry put police on alert all over India, warning them to stand by to protect public buildings. That warning was issued with the news that the army had captured the Golden Temple at Amritsar after a 3-day battle. Now the likelihood of trouble is increased with the news that the Sikh militant leader, Sant Bhindranwale, has been found dead.
To his followers, Bhindranwale was a holy man with a vision of an autonomous Sikh state. To his opponents, he was a ruthless fanatic who ordered the deaths of hundreds in the hope of achieving it. Blending nationalism and religion, rather like an Indian Ayatollah Khomeini, he inspired his followers both to kill and to die. Moderate Sikh leaders, with whom the government might have compromised, found their support dwindling. Now, with Bhindranwale a martyr, they've been eclipsed.
Violence is always endemic in this country and under the surface, and I'm sure it will continue for quite some time. The government has sought instead of a political settlement, a settlement with a gun, and I think they've left no choice with the Sikh extremists but to answer back with a gun.
The army say they're moving to round up extremists still at large with their arms. The army say they've solved the problem. The Sikhs, angry and aroused, don't see it so simply.
The Environment Secretary, Patrick Jenkin, has been to see the more run-down areas of Liverpool, and he had a hostile reception from some of the people who live there. Later, he admitted the housing is the worst he's ever seen. Neil Bennett was with him.
Patrick Jenkin didn't come to Liverpool to offer the city a pot of gold, but some of the housing he saw on his brief tour he acknowledged was utterly appalling. He said every possible source of funds, both public and private, had to be tapped urgently. Only minutes after setting off, his coach was stopped by local people. After promising them he'd come back to the area as soon as he could, they let him continue. At another estate, he left his coach to see housing conditions for himself. Residents told him in no uncertain terms what they thought of them.
And the smells in the houses are just terrible.
It's unlivable.
Unlivable,
they are.
And we're paying
£26 a week rent. £26 a week, up to £32 a week is getting paid for these. And they should be paying us to live in them.
The most hostile reception of the day was at the town hall, where Mr. Jenkin had gone to give his impressions of the visit.
Of course I was very well aware that some of these housing conditions are appalling, and what I've seen this afternoon confirms that. Indeed, I've seen some families living in conditions the like of which I have not seen before, and I would like that to be recorded. They are very, very grim indeed.
Although this ministerial visit to Liverpool wasn't intended to be about the budget crisis, that still has to be resolved. There's no sign tonight of the council backing down over its illegal spending plans. And, like it or not, Mr. Jenkin may yet find himself saddled with the